In this next set of videos, we're going to look at some rigging techniques that are geared towards making your character easier to animate by adding functionality to the rig. You'll find these in the Constraint Node section of the library. The first constraint I want to talk about is called the 2-point constraint. What it does is kind of like an additional type of deformer, but instead of adding control points with the rigging tool, we can just use pegs. I've got this super simple character made up of just the body and a face, and I'll attach a 2-point constraint to it. These right 2 ports are where we attach our 2 pegs. I'm just going to make 2 pegs and attach them, and then the key is to set the pivot points of the pegs in the right place. The right port is the primary port, so we want that at the base of our character. I'm going to set the rightmost one to the bottom and the left one to the top. Now if we move the pegs, it stretches the body and face between the 2 points. You can see it automatically adds squash and stretch as well, which is really nice. You can control that effect in the settings for the constraint node. Active controls how strong the overall influence of the transformation on your drawing is. Everything below here lets you balance the individual effects on different properties. Volume modifier defines how much the width changes based on the distance between the pegs. 0 means it won't change width at all, and 100 means it will squash and stretch based on the max and min values below. The volume max is the maximum width when squashed, and min is the minimum width when stretched. These values are percentages, so the max is 200% the original width, and the min is 25% of the original width. Distance max is how far apart your points can get before the constraint stops having any effect. 0 means no limit, but anything else is a percentage. So 150 means it can only stretch by an additional 50% before the peg stops having influence. This is why it matters which peg you put in the right port to be the primary peg. Distance min is the reverse for when your points get closer together. Skew modifier affects whether the drawings get skewed or rotated when the pegs are off-center. The higher this value, the more the image will get skewed, and the lower, the more it will just rotate instead. Smoothing is for when you have a max distance and you extend beyond it. Normally it just stops instantly, but with smoothing, you can add a buffer distance over which it will ease into the stopping distance. If you have a max distance, it's good to have this one on. And point balance is also for when you extend beyond your max distance. At 0, your drawing stays fixed to your primary point, but if you up it to 100, it will go along with the secondary point instead. And at 50, it will stay halfway between them. Then, for our purposes, we're going to leave all of these dropdowns here on their default. Now there's a few other constraints that work in basically the same way. There's the 3-point constraint node, which lets you plug in 3 pegs, and there's the multi-port constraint that lets you attach however many you want. The difference is, with more points, you get less options in the settings and have to rely on the default behavior more. We'll use multi-port constraints later, but for now, we'll stick with the 2-point constraint. The last thing I want to show you about these constraint nodes is this leftmost little turquoise port. This is for attaching a constraint switch to. The constraint switch lets you control the active value of the constraints that it's attached to. In fact, if you hit the Show Controls button, it even gives you a slider interface here to control the strength of your constraints. The reason you would use a constraint switch is because it can be attached to multiple different constraint nodes at the same time, and allow you to control them simultaneously. So if you need a way to control the strength of multiple constraints without having to go into the settings, that's a good way to go. Next, let's look at an example of using the 2-point constraint on a character. We're going to rig this character's legs in a special way that starts with using a 2-point constraint. I'll focus in on the left leg here. All this down here is just the auto patch system. All we care about is up here above the leg and foot layers. I'm going to get our 2-point constraint node and put it on our leg. And we can actually just use the leg and foot pegs as our two control pegs, since their pivot points are exactly where we want them at either end of the leg. Now all we have to do is move the foot peg, and that basically works already. However, when we get too squashed, it makes the lines noticeably thicker. And when it widens, it sticks out at the ankle and hip. So I'll turn the volume modifier down to 25, and that looks a lot better. And now I want more control over how the leg bends. So I'm going to add a curve deformer on the leg below the 2-point constraint. And now we can change how the leg bends or straightens if we need to. And to rotate it at the hip, we always have the master leg peg to use. This is pretty good, but we can further enhance the functionality of this leg with the next constraint node we're going to look at, the transformation limit. We'll learn some ways to use that in the next video. I'll see you there.